Hi everyone, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Laura. I work on accessibility here at Google. It's great to be here today, and accessibility is something that's really, really critical and core to our mission here at Google. To organize the world's information, make it universally accessible and useful. And 15% of the global population has some form of a disability. And we need to be thinking about, how people are actually interacting with our interfaces and with our devices, kind of stripping away those assumptions of how we might think that they're interacting and really building inclusive products. When we are thinking about the principles of accessible design, it's often helpful to kind of break down the groups into personas of users and think about the different interaction models that people might be using. So we can break down into a few different groups. For example, we might be thinking about blind or low vision users, deaf or hard of hearing users, people with motor or dexterity challenges, and people who are considered neurologically diverse or who have a range of intellectual disabilities. But there's a huge population of people that absolutely needs to be factored into this discussion, and that's the aging population, which has been growing and growing since life expectancies have thankfully been increasing over the years. And the World Health Organization estimates that by 2050, over 2 billion people will be over the age of 60. It's a huge population. And as we all age, we may experience disabilities in different ways. We may experience just slight deterioration of certain senses, of vision, of hearing, of dexterity, for example, and many other sorts of things. So as technologists, it's really, really important for us to factor in the needs of this very important and very large population. So we're super excited about today. Tim?
Jeff Johnson is a professor of computer science at the University of San Francisco. There he teaches courses that introduce students to computer science and also special topics in human-computer interaction. Beyond academia, Jeff has worked as a UI designer and implementer, an engineering manager, a usability tester, and a researcher at companies like Cromemco, Xerox, US West, Hewlett-Packard Labs, and Sun Microsystems. Building on a PhD in psychology, Jeff has spent decades contributing to our understanding of human-computer interaction. He's addressed both technical and social issues, including working as chair of Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility in the late 80s and early 90s. In 2016, Professor Johnson was recognized with a Lifetime Achievement in Practice Award from SIGCHI, the ACM Special Interest Group on Computer-Human Interaction. At the award ceremony, Stanford professor Terry Winograd cited the influence of Professor Johnson's books on interface design. Many of these books stem from the idea that you learn more from things that don't work than from things that do. Today, Professor Johnson will be sharing lessons that he's learned from things that don't work because our bodies change with age. In designing user interfaces for an aging population, Jeff and his collaborator Kate Finn have built a comprehensive resource for technology developers seeking to produce products that can be easily and successfully used by older adults. Please join me now in welcoming Jeff and Kate to Google Today.
Thank you. Is my microphone loud enough? It is? Okay, good. I want to thank Tim and Laura for giving the first half of my talk. So this talk is going to be based on a book that Kate Finn, who's sitting back there, and I wrote. The book is over there, and apparently Tim is going to be giving away copies of it later. And then there's some other books I wrote sitting there for you to look at. Okay, so the population of the world is aging. On the average, people live longer, birth rates are low, and so humanity on the average is growing older. So let's look at some numbers so that we can see how much it's changing. These are the top 10 countries in the world that have populations of people over 50. And by the way, in our book, we use 50 as in the line for indicating older adults. The reason that we picked that number is that most of the research that we read in preparation of the book uses that number. So that age is an arbitrary age. Some researchers talk about 60, some use 65, but the bulk of them use 50, and so we decided to use that number. Okay, so if we look at these top 10 countries, China has nearly 400 million people over the age of 50. India has about 230 million. The US is third. Japan is fourth and coming up fast. It's got the most rapidly growing percentage of people over 50. We can also look at the information this way. If you look at, in 2015, basically almost 20% of people in the less developed areas of the world were over 50. Now, in the less developed world, or what we call the developing world, population growth rates tend to be, birth rates tend to be higher, and therefore there's a larger percentage of younger adults. And so the average age of the population tends to be lower than in the developed world. So in the developed world, we can see that in 2015, there was nearly 40% of the population over 50. And then, as you can see, the numbers are expected to grow over the next several decades. Yet another way to look at what's going on is, people say, well, old people don't use technology, they don't go online, but that's not really true. As we can see from this chart, this is broken out by age groups, and so as you can see, the 18 to 29-year-olds have pretty much been online and are still that way, nearly 100%. The next age group is slightly less, and then when we get to 50-year-olds to 64, it's slightly less, but it's still growing. And then the fastest growing demographic online is people over 65. Now, this graph is a little bit problematic because although it sort of seems to show these growth rates, it's problematic because people who are in one age group age into another age group, and therefore, of course, this lower line is going to go up as the people who are on this line become over 65, right? So this chart has been shown by Pew Internet to show that people are increasingly going online, but I have some questions about this chart. So I prefer to look at it more like this, where we take people by birth generation, which you don't move out of your birth generation, you stay in it. So we have millennials, people who were in 2016, 18 to 34. Then we have Gen X, younger boomers, et cetera. And we can look at the percentages of them that have adopted technology, what we call digital technology. Now, when we say technology in this talk, or when I say it, I essentially mean digital technology because, of course, a horse and a buggy is technology. It's just older technology. So the question is, where are people? What kind of technology are people using? So for the purpose of this talk, I'm referring to digital technology. We can also break it out by device. So we can see that for tablets, there's not a lot of variability in who's using tablets by age group. There's some, but not a whole lot. There's not that much with cell phones of all types. Nearly 100% of people 18 to 29, or actually Pew puts it at 100%, are using, and again, we're talking about the developed world, are using digital technology or cell phones. And it doesn't vary that much by age. The oldest age group, 65 and over, is at 80%. But when we look at smartphones, there is more of an age disparity. But again, those bars are all going up. And especially the smartphone for 65 plus, that's going up. 2 years ago, it was at 30%, now it's at 42. Okay, so it's going up. Laptops and desktops and tablets actually have been seen to slip in the general population over the last couple of years, according to Pew Research. They've started to drop a little bit. Okay, so now the interesting thing about the older than 50 population is that technology, digital technology, can actually help them quite a bit. And here are some quotes that were gleaned from online sources of people writing comments in response to articles about technology and older adults. And so here's an example of a quote. A Mac laptop opened the world to me right here from my kitchen table, and it helped me because of my physical disability. My mobility is limited. So this one, for the benefit of people who might not be able to see this very well, says, I can keep in touch with people all over the world. This one, I feel so connected in so much of the world: art, music, nature, comedy, humanity. And this one, it says, technology has helped me move 19 times in the past 9 years, taking everything with me. I can't imagine going back to life without a computer. So these are the kinds of things that technology can do for people whose mobility is a little bit limited or who are socially isolated. On the other hand, if we don't design the technology well, then we'll also get comments like these, which are also gleaned from online sources. Okay, you know, how can I make the font bigger? I can't see it. I wish they'd stop changing things for no good reason. All the technology is just so confusing to me. Who thought thin gray letters was a good idea? I hear that one a lot. So much to remember. What happened to the menus? I don't know where to get help. Is this the website or an app? Actually, I don't think that's so age dependent. A lot of my students at USF don't know the difference between a website and an app. Where did my cursor go? Those kind of things. So poorly designed technology can lead to these kinds of problems especially for older adults. Now, these problems are not restricted to older adults, but they impact older adults. They tend to impact older adults more than the general population. So, you know, illegible text, bad passwords, hard to remember passwords, CAPTCHAs, small targets, and the difficulty of getting tech support. Those are all problems that lots of people encounter, but older adults encounter them more often. So let me just show you an example of someone who was in a usability test that Kate and I conducted a few years ago. We were looking at older adults using travel websites that were aimed at older adults. So you may not know, but there's a whole industry, there's a whole segment of the travel industry that's aimed at people who are essentially retired because they have money and time. So there are various companies, and so we tried a bunch of those websites with older adults, some of whom are frequent travelers. So these are not people who are homebound people. And so you get situations like this in the test.
So at this point, if you were, you know, really looking for a trip, what would you do next if we weren't here? What do you think?
I would screw this. I would say, you know, if I can't get to what I want in reasonable tries, then this is not I don't want to go to this company.
So they just lost a customer. So there's a researcher in Britain named Alan F. Newell, who's different from the Alan Newell that many of us know in the United States, but this is Alan F. Newell, who has been researching designing for older adults for many years. And one of his famous quotes is, "Design for older adults and you design for almost everyone else." There are many populations that have similar usability issues to older adults. People with low vision, physical impairments, low literacy, little or obsolete technical experience, second language learners, and cognitive impairments. As we get older, people often get these kind of disabilities occurring, and it varies tremendously, as you know, right? There are some people who at age 95 are running marathons and writing books, and there are other people who at age 60 are not capable of those kinds of things. So, and the other point you can make is that everyone is impaired at least some of the time. Even young people can have trouble in some situations. We often use the word situationally disabled. So you could have somebody who is trying to use their cell phone on a bus, and the bus happens to be driving down. I don't know if you've been to San Francisco recently, but many streets in San Francisco are currently being torn up as PG&E tries to update 50-year-old gas lines. And so all these streets are torn up, and so the buses and taxis and Uber cars and everything are bouncing along like this, and people are trying to use their cell phones and having trouble texting. And then, of course, you have very common situations like this one, like someone trying to use a cell phone while riding a horse. But the point is that the world shakes, and therefore you suddenly have tremors. You have hand tremors. So it's not just for old people that we're designing this, that we're trying to make the technology accessible. In fact, we can look at it as trying to build the digital equivalent of curb cuts, because if you're familiar with curb cuts, they were mandated by city ordinances and maybe state ordinances that tried to make sure that that people in wheelchairs could use sidewalks. But the percentage of people who use wheelchairs over curb cuts is actually very low compared to people on skateboards, people pulling roller bags, people pushing shopping carts, people pushing all sorts of wheeled devices. So curb cuts actually help a large segment of the population, even though they were put in place specifically for people in wheelchairs. That's what we're looking for. Another example of that kind of technology is OXO kitchen appliances. How many of you are familiar with OXO kitchen appliances? Anyone? So the story is that this guy who was kind of an inventor, noticed that his wife, who had arthritis in her hands, was having difficulty peeling the potatoes, and rather than helping her peel the potatoes, he invented a special potato peeler for her, which his friends started saying, "Hey, that's really cool. I want one. I want one. I want one. I want one." And so he launched this company and started making these things, and now they're famous for making ergonomically designed kitchen appliances. So that's what we're looking for in the digital world. These things that can help make digital technology more accessible to older adults and everyone else at the same time. Well, we've been doing user interface design for a long time. There's a big user interface design group here at Google. They went to some of the same universities and took some of the same courses that I did. We should all know how to do this by now, right? The problem is that we don't. And some of the reasons are given here in this list, we tend to design for people like ourselves. Technology producers tend to be somewhat young and have little experience with older adults. If you just provide them with data, that's not good enough. It doesn't make enough of an impression. Older adults are often not included in usability tests or user research for logistical reasons. Some people just don't think aging is a sexy topic. So it often gets ignored. There's also an argument out there that Kate and I have heard, and you probably heard too, which is that, well, the old people today who don't know how to use technology, they're going to die. And so let's not worry about that, because everyone who's grown up with technology is going to grow up and they're going to know how to use it, and therefore we don't need to design, especially for those old people. And so the terminology that's been used is we refer to digital natives versus digital immigrants. So technically, I'm a digital immigrant because when I was born, digital technology didn't really much exist, or at least it wasn't used by the public. And so I didn't grow up with it until I was, in college, and especially true for my parents. My parents did not grow up with it. So we're digital immigrants, and then the people who grew up with the technology all their lives, essentially, are called the digital natives. And so the idea of this argument is just wait until the digital natives take over and everything will be fine. We won't have to design, especially for those older adults. That argument doesn't hold water, and I'll show you why. We're familiar mostly with these generations. So there's the GI generation, silent generation, baby boomers, et cetera. And the blue bars show the ages in which they were born. So those generations are defined by the range of years in which they were born. And so we can see when the GI generation was born on this chart. We can see when the silent generation, which is my parents, were born, baby boomers, which is the generation I'm in, Generation X, Millennials, and the Generation Z, Homeland, those are the kids who are being born now. Okay? And so the Millennials are my students, my college students right now. But what's important is not the age at which these people were born, these generations were born. What's important is the age at which, what was going on in the world when they were between 10 and 25, because those are known as the formative years, where they become used to whatever technology existed at the time. So we look at that, and we can see that these are the bands of age at which each of those generations these are the spans of years at which each of these generations is between 10 and 25. So we look at those, and then we take that and project, we're going to project that onto this graph, which is a different graph. This one shows the range of years in which certain kinds of technology were dominant. So we call this technology generations. So we can see that 1900 to the late 30s was the mechanical era. Equipment was mechanical. And from the late 30s to 1960 was electromechanical era. I remember as a child, Hoover vacuum cleaners and things like that, things that were partly electrical and partly mechanical. But I grew up mainly in the analog electronic age, and then there was the personal computer and basic internet age, the web search and e-commerce age, which hasn't ended yet, digital music, social and mobile, which haven't ended yet. So the question is, how do the human generations, formative years, compare to these time bands? And what we see is that each of the human generations kind of span a couple of different technology eras. So my parents, who were in the silent generation, grew up partly in electromechanical and partly in the analog electronic age. You know, those stereos that us old people have in our living rooms now, is analog electronic. And then personal computer, Gen X started out with the personal computer and basic internet age, but was still in their formative years when web search and e-commerce started, and a little bit when digital music started. And then we have the Millennials, who grew up mostly in the era of these technologies, social and mobile digital music. And Gen Z, of course, who are being born now, they're going to grow up with all of this stuff. Okay, so let's look exactly at what some of that means. In the analog electronic world that, let's say, I grew up with, there is no notion of navigating through a user interface. That is to say, a user interface is all there on the control panel. Okay, and so there's the television, there's the controls, and maybe there's some controls on the back that I hardly ever use. And there's the phone, and there's all the controls for it. There's the Zenith radio and all the controls for it. There's my auto dashboard, and there's all the controls for it. I do not have to navigate through the user interface. Okay? So say you grew up with that notion of the world, and then suddenly you're plopped into a world in which there are multiple applications on a screen, and you have to figure out which one you're in and go from one page to the next page, and then you look at your phone, and now one moment it looks like this, and the next moment it looks like that, okay? So you have to actually get from one place to another in the user interface. That's a foreign concept. You did not grow up with that. You had to learn that after you were 25. And that's not necessarily easy. And you know, here's a Tesla instrument panel, 1 minute, and that's the same instrument panel the next minute. So you are having to learn a whole new paradigm for interacting with technology. So that's why those technology generations and the position of your generation while you were doing your formative years, why that matters. Okay, so there's all that, that's a whole packet of reasons why the age-friendly design problem will not disappear. But there's yet another reason, which is that most of us experience age-related changes, and those are not going to go away either. Okay, so those age-related changes are going to happen to your children and their children as well as to us. And those changes occur in vision, motor control, speech and hearing, cognition, attention, learning, memory, and knowledge and attitude. And I would have to say the bulk of the book talks about these changes. There's a chapter devoted to each one of those bullets. What are the changes, and then what do you do to design so that those changes are not a barrier. Now, before I go into those changes, because this talk can be depressing up to this point, when you look at that and you go, oh my gosh, what do I have to look forward to? Nothing. Okay, so here's a slide about some good things about aging, which Kate prompted me to put into here so that we wouldn't all, go commit harikari. Oh, did I just turn off the microphone? Is it still on? Okay, good. Cognitive psychologists make a distinction between crystallized versus fluid intelligence. Fluid intelligence is and both of them are measured to a certain extent by intelligence tests. Crystallized intelligence is what you would call knowledge. And of course that grows with age. Fluid intelligence is sort of the ability to solve novel problems on the spot. And that increases with age until a certain age and then starts to decline. And then, again, it's highly variable. In some people, it doesn't decline, and in others, it declines steeply. Greater vocabulary with age, more real-world experience to draw from, less tendency to worry, higher rates of life satisfaction, senior discounts, and as someone said, it's better than the alternative. Okay, so because my talk is supposedly limited to about 40 minutes, I am going to not cover all of the age-related changes that the book covers, not even close. I'm just going to sample a couple of them. And if you're interested, you can read the book, which apparently they're going to be giving away some copies of, or at least giving them to groups, I guess, to have as a resource. So with vision, for example, these are the kinds of things that can occur, don't necessarily occur, but they can occur. So decreased ability to focus close, or farsightedness is another way of putting it. Presbyopia is the technical term. Lower sensitivity to light, heightened sensitivity to glare, lens yellowing, etc. So here's some examples. So if you're looking at a screen of a cell phone and your vision is normal, what's depicted on the left is supposedly that. So what that is just a standard screen of some app. And then if you have presbyopia or farsightedness and you've forgotten your reading glasses, which I apparently have forgotten, I normally carry them here, you might not be able to read what's on the screen if the font is too small or the text is too light. Then glare sensitivity is just what it sounds like because of a lifetime of exposure to scratches and things. Your cornea and your retina might be scratched. Not retina, but your cornea and your lens might be scratched, and therefore you're going to experience glare, and that might inhibit your ability to read or to see detail or to work at night. I have friends who are my age who will not drive at night anymore because the lights on oncoming cars are too glaring to them. But consider this. You're 28 years old and you go out to the swimming pool and you pull out your phone and the sun's glaring down on a screen that's not designed for sun glaring down on it, okay? So glare sensitivity is not restricted to older adults. In some situations, it can apply to people of all ages. Then we have lens yellowing, which is when your lens exposed to ultraviolet light over many years becomes, your lens and your cornea become yellowed, and therefore any app that uses blue versus green as a information carrying element becomes hard to distinguish, or if, as I've seen some apps, some news apps put ads or pseudo news with a yellow background. Well, everything's yellow on my screen, so I can't see those. And then reduced light sensitivity. The average 60-year-old needs 3 times as much light as a 20-year-old to be able to perceive the same brightness. And so things are going to look darker. What we often do when Kate and I actually give a workshop on this topic is we bring in a whole bunch of sunglasses and have people in the room put them on, and then it makes the whole room dark. And that's what some people experience when they get older. So, some examples. For example, tiny text. So tiny text is a rampant problem. Everyone complains about it. Everyone over 50 complains about it pretty much. And so the Social Security Administration, which you would think would be aimed at older adults, their website, let's just say the method that they provide for making the font larger is not so easy. because what happens is you go to their home page, you say, I can't read some of this, let me make the font bigger. So you scroll down to the bottom, you see, you look carefully if you can read any of this. Eventually you find, let's see, accessibility is what I'm looking for, and I'm not even seeing it here. Oh, there it is, yes, right there. Okay. By the way, visual search among older adults slows down. Okay, so anyway, we'll come back to that. So you click on accessibility, if you can find it, and then it takes you to this accessibility page, which you then scroll down, and it says, I can't see very well. As soon as you see that, you see, I can't see very well. If you can find it, then you click on increase text size, and you would expect that to increase the text size, but what does it do? It tells you how to increase the text size in your browser, which nobody is going to do. They're going to hit back, 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 close the browser, and say, you know what, I didn't need to do that anyway. Whereas at Senior Health, we give it a thumbs up or a green check mark because basically they have a little widget on their home page which you just click the letter there and makes the font bigger or smaller, whatever you want. Okay. In addition to straight visual defects or deficits that occur in some people with age, there's visual cognitive deficits. So as I mentioned, older adults are known to be slower on visual search tasks, and there's also difficulty finding very small, subtle screen elements. So one small, subtle screen element that many of us are familiar with is this little bar at the bottom of our Macintosh screen, which has little black dots that indicate that an app is running or not. But the people we talk to in the senior centers where Kate has done some work can't see those dots. They might as well not be there. Now, one could argue that on Macintosh it's not that important to know whether an application is running or not, but they try to provide the information, they're just not providing it for a large segment of the population. And then we have situations like this one at Rhodes Scholar, which is one of these travel agencies that targets older adults. So let's say you're looking at a trip and you're thinking about, it's too bad I didn't bring my reading glasses. Suppose you're wanting to, you're looking down here and you're wanting to travel on this trip, and you say, okay, February 27th, 2016, I don't like those dates, let me change the dates of the trip. So you change the dates, okay, this is a good date, I will like this trip. But you may not notice that the price, which is over here, just went up by $300. Okay? Now, maybe Rhodes Scholar wants you to not notice that the price just went up by $300. But anyway, this is not good design because obviously there's a sort of a visual attention change blindness problem designed in here. I mentioned that visual search for older adults is slower. Here's an example. So if I put you on this Amazon page and I say, tell me how many items are in your shopping cart, that is a visual search task in which people of all ages will perform at approximately the same speed. Because everyone knows, or at least people who've been using Amazon at all, know where their shopping cart is, upper right. So that won't vary by age. But if I tell people instead to tell me what are some of the benefits, find some of the benefits of Amazon Prime membership, then what we get into is a search task that for the older people is slower. And there are various reasons for that, which I won't go into right now. Things are going on cognitively. Then in terms of motor control, the kinds of things that can occur as people age, and again, don't necessarily always occur, but sometimes do, are reduced hand-eye coordination, fine motor control, strength, reduced strength, slower movements, and stiffness. So one of the ways you have of measuring that as a researcher is noticing that a Fitts law curve, how many of you have heard of Fitts law? So Fitts law is the law that sort of helps you predict how long it will take someone whose pointer or finger is one place to move to another target spot. That curve flattens out with age, meaning that the peak velocity is lower, the acceleration rate at the beginning of the movement is lower, and so the overall time to reach and hit the target is longer. So what those kinds of motor control changes cause is difficulty grasping and manipulating small objects, difficulty with continuous movements like click, drag, tap, drag, tap, hold, pinch, spread, double tap gestures. One of the things that I am amused by, or maybe not amused is a better term, on the Macintosh and also on many iPhones, the accessibility features are turned on and off via gestures that many older adults cannot execute reliably. So older adults have difficulty often executing coordinated gestures. Also, there's a decreased consistency of movement. Just because I can click on that target or do a pinch spread right now doesn't mean I'll be able to do it in a minute. Okay, the same way. One thing that's happening to me with increasing frequency is I'm trying to grab something and drag it to a new place and losing it in the meantime, and I don't know where it went, if it falls into a folder or something. Greater risk of an unintentional click or touch. Accidental selection of objects. So here's a video, again from the travel study, of someone trying to book a trip to Kenya using a menu system, a website that has menus that are pull right. So you pull them down, and then you have to pull to the right in order to get the submenu. You've all seen those kind of menus, I'm sure. So let's watch.
So like when I went up here to, to get the country first, I went up here to go to, go up here to this bouncing around a Kenya thing here. Okay, so I went in here, down to Africa. It's taken me like 5 times to click on country.
So, anyone had any trouble with those kind of menus? Okay, and so it's not just older adults. Then there are cognitive changes like attention, learning, and memory, reduced short-term memory, less effective long-term memory storage, less generalization between situations, people more easily overwhelmed. So here's an example of the latter.
At this point, I would call them. This is so overwhelming.
Okay.
I would call them and say, help.
Okay, now I should say this person travels all over the world, sets up clinics and libraries and schools, is very well educated and very well traveled, not at all senile, but is totally overwhelmed by the travel website of the company that she almost always uses to go traveling. And so what does she do? She looks at the site to get out what trips exist, and then she gets on the telephone. Cognitive guidelines that come out of this kind of thing are to focus attention on important information and calls to action. which is not what drugstore.com does. Okay, so drugstore.com is aimed at people over 50, but with all this stuff changing, I mean, we found that when big images change on a page, people who are especially not in the generation that know about navigation and user interfaces think that they've gone to a different page. It took me to a different page. Why did it do that? It didn't take you to a different page. It just changed that picture. Oh, I thought it was on a different page. So the Android voice recorder is the paradigmatic example of simplicity. It can't get much more simple than that. So that's one call to action on the screen at a time, and that's good. In our book, that's good. Literally in our book, that's good. And then there's knowledge differences like these. So unfamiliar with digital check jargon and icons, not knowing control gestures, but older people have greater domain knowledge. That is, tests have shown that older adults are actually better at doing search tasks when the search tasks are ill-defined. They're not as good as younger people at doing well-defined search tasks. What is the capital of Brazil? Okay, that's a well-defined search task. But an ill-defined search task is find a vacation that you would like. Okay, that's ill-defined. Older adults actually have more domain knowledge and can solve those problems usually faster than young adults. So here's an example of unfamiliar vocabulary. Check for update. A new update is available. In this version, you will have the option to select between light and dark UI themes from the settings menu. Well, my aunt would think that that is unemployment insurance or something. UI is a technical term that we use in the field. It should not be in a user interface of a mobile phone. And here's one of my pet peeves is, what is the menu system? What is the symbol for a menu? Well, over here in this app is, so this is Android's voicemail app. The menu is 3 dots. In Google Translate, it's the hamburger. In Waze, it's a dancing pig. Okay, so can we agree that it would be a good idea to settle on one symbol for what a menu is, right? Rather than having ones that not only, see, what we're doing is requiring people who didn't grow up with this stuff to learn these things, but to learn them in the context of having inconsistencies in what are the symbols. That's not easy. I use UPS as an example of a well-designed website that works for everybody. So the last thing I'll mention is that our book has a chapter on why and how to include older adults in development. And actually, we also have a chapter on case studies of other organizations and companies that have designed for older adults successfully by including older adults in the development process. So there are a variety of publications and methods for making sure that the people who you're doing your user research with include some people over 50. Here's an example of some students at a college who are developing lightweight walkers that are actually more portable and easy to put in a car and things like that, and are very lightweight and stable. And so they develop some prototypes out of tubing and things, and then they try them out with actual older adults. So that's one method, is really using older adults in your research. Another method that has been used is, it's called Empathic Design, but basically you put a suit on a 25-year-old that restricts their movement, and you tell them design a car that you can get in and out of easily. Ford actually does this, okay? And some auto companies actually do that. They put people in suits, or they put goggles on them that restrict their vision, or they put things on their heads that restrict their hearing, and they say, design a system that you can use with all of the impairments that this stuff we're putting on you, that will work despite that. So that's another way to inspire empathic design. So we give this kind of advice. Include older adults in participatory design and evaluation. Be sensitive in communication when you're doing it. Avoid technical jargon and elder speak. And optimize the sessions. There's a lot you have to do when you're using people who are in their 70s and 80s. When you're doing usability testing, that's not the same as you would do with people who are in their 20s, including allowing extra time and eating the cookies that they offer you.
What's elder speak?
Elder speak it's sort of like, you've read about kid speak. So motherese is the word for when you talk to a 2-year-old, like, hello, Billy, please come into the room now, and use this sort of stressed language, which actually linguists have said helps people learn language, right? But when you do that with older adults, and people tend to do this with people who are in their 80s, oh, here's Grandma. Grandma, how are you? Grandma's going, I'm fine. Why are you yelling at me? Just when you go to a senior center and you're helping people learn how to use iPads, don't do that. So the summary is these things. There's a growing number of older adults in the world. The percentage of older adults is increasing. A person's technology generation influences which technologies they're going to be comfortable with. And here's the thing is, I always like to say, people now who are young think, okay, so I'm always going to know how to use this stuff. But 25 years from now, we will not have digital technology, we'll have quantum technology. And the paradigms will be different. And so people will be saying, I just don't get this quantum technology, but my kids, maybe they can fix all my quantum equipment for me, So get used to it. The world changes, and you're not going to keep up with everything. You will keep up with certain things, especially if it's related to your job. Usability issues can exclude older people from benefits of today's digital culture, which are great for that population, for older adults. The benefits, I am a firm believer in the benefits of digital technology for older adults, and we just have to make sure that they can benefit from it. So, with that, I will say thank you very much. Are there questions?
We can take questions live in this room. We also have a Dory, which, Tim, I think you have pulled up, right?
That's right. Are there any questions in here first? If not, I'll just read from the Dory. Okay. So I had a question.
And maybe Kate can pitch in on some of these questions, too.
So for me, it seems that a big challenge in this work is helping people to accept the fact that their abilities are changing. What have you seen that's helpful for this, to help people accept the fact that maybe things aren't what they used to be?
Well, let me first say one thing that is not helpful. There have been attempts to develop, computers for older people. They don't do well in the market because people look at them and go, I would never use that. I'm not old. You see, the thing is, actually, the AARP has done a survey of their members and found out that none of their members are old. Only the parents of their members are old. See, you're never old. Your parents are the ones who are old, however old you are, right? So any piece of equipment that marks you as an older adult is not going to be popular. So the question is, how can we do this in a way that doesn't sort of say, this is the technology for older adults and this is the technology for everyone else? So I don't know if I answered the question, which was, how do you get people to recognize that these things are happening? I don't really have a general answer to that question. I guess what I can say is that from my own personal experience, it was kind of forced on me when I suddenly realized, well, I had cataract surgery in one eye, and then they gave me a fake lens in the other eye. And first I asked if I could have one that did telephoto, but they said they couldn't do that. Now I have to wear reading glasses all the time, unless when I'm reading at distances closer than a couple of feet. And so I didn't have any choice but to accept the fact that these changes are occurring. When I was in college, I did gymnastics. If I tried those things now, I would probably die. So I'm not going to do them. Kate, do you have any?
Yeah, I don't think it's an answered question. I think that in our culture, especially, in our culture especially, aging is, like we said, not sexy, and people don't embrace it, and people don't want to admit to it or own up to it. And what Jeff said about stigmatizing people by giving them dumbed down interfaces or applications is definitely not the answer. People don't want, few people, have you ever seen the jitterbug phone? I mean, it's simple, but it's pretty insulting to a lot of people, depending. I mean, some people it's okay. So I think that my answer is we need a cultural shift. We need to embrace aging and not make it so ostracized.
Yeah, I mean, in some cultures, it's actually cool to be old, right? In Japan, it is, the elders are more respected. And, if you happen to be a Maasai living in the Tanzania, in the Serengeti, the elders are, looked greatly up to, but not in our culture.
Okay, many older folks are on a fixed income, so they can't afford to replace their phones or laptops every 3 years. What problems does this pose?
Can I talk? I addressed a conference on the digital divide earlier this year, and the cost of equipment and trying to install it and trying to get technology support were enormous. And so many people who fall in the cracks there abandon the technology if it's too challenging for them. And it's really irresponsible for those of us who are responsible for such things to shut them out like that, to not make things easy or for them to use and set up and maintain, or for the government to not make broadband basically free and make a economic divide too. So it's a big divider for older people and people on fixed incomes. Yeah.
Not only the cost, but also there's a mindset, which is, this Royal typewriter was passed down to me by my father, and his father passed it to him. Why shouldn't I be able to pass on my Macintosh to my kids or grandkids? We could design this thing so that there's a little module that I switched out, and that was the CPU, and I put in a new one every 3 years rather than having to spend $3,000 for a whole new machine, right? The display doesn't change.
Instead of built-in obsolescence, have it be.
Right.
We talk about, especially
the
with
phone.
older adults, people get hand-me-ups instead of hand-me-downs now. They give their parents or their grandparents their old phone or something.
Right.
I think he's good.
Okay, let me ask this, which is, I think, a little bit related. So, Jeff, I was looking back through some of your earlier writings, and I saw that you were writing in the 90s about the public interest in having a national information infrastructure. How does net neutrality affect our efforts to build a more accessible world?
Well, my personal belief is that that net neutrality would help, but it's apparently been done away with as of yesterday. You know, I grew up with a notion of the internet as an example of something that we formerly in the telephone era called common carriage. So common carriage was a term that was actually created when stagecoaches were running letters around, and basically the idea is that Wells Fargo stagecoaches should not put any priority on Wells Fargo messages over anybody else's messages. I should be able to put any letter on the Pony Express and it should be able to get there in exactly the same amount of time for exactly the same amount of money. So common carriage was born, and it was applied to railroads and to trucking, and then to the telephone company, and then to the internet. So, and the word for common carriage in the internet age was net neutrality, and now that is being gotten rid of. And so the question is, how will that impact what?
Accessibility.
Yeah, so companies that can control everything and that are not regulated can always go for the low-hanging fruit in their particular industry, whatever it may be. One of the things that's happening in San Francisco is that the cab companies, which are highly regulated and must give rides to people who are have disabilities of various kinds, feel like they're being regulated while Uber and Lyft don't have those same restrictions applied to them, so the playing field is not level. But so what we see is drivers in Uber and Lyft and things like that who just do not want to pick up people who are mobility impaired, for example.
Okay, I think this is our last question. It's the last one on the dory, unless I see a wave. Oh, yeah, okay. Let's have this question before we do that.
Hi, thank you for your talk today. What are your thoughts on the potential for voice interfaces to serve the needs of older adults? And I will stipulate that there are real issues to solve around comprehension and comprehensibility, but let's say we're addressing those as fast as we can. More broadly, how might voice interfaces help?
I think it shows a lot of promise in not having to relearn things, especially if, you know, we're not talking about somebody having to learn a command line interface that they just speak. If it's a natural language interface and very generalized, broad topic, I think something I actually talked to Tim about the first time I met him was, I don't understand why you can't say to Siri, change my contrast settings, you know? Why can't, it's kind of a meta interface, because why do I need to know what password or what protocol or something? You just need to do this for me, or I should ask you to do this for me. And I think that if you lay over, I don't know if you want to call it AI on top of voice interface, or some huge amount of smarts on top of a spoken interface, even if it doesn't level the playing field, would make things an awful lot easier.
Yeah.
Having said that, there is some difficulty with automatic speech recognition for older voices that have trembles and inconsistent volumes and things.
Yeah, the frequency of speech tends to go up as we age, the auditory frequency. And yeah,
If it
as
can
you were saying,
handle
there.
if the algorithm, if the
Yeah.
recognition can handle it, that's great.
Yeah, I mean, the problem that Kate was referring to, for example, is that it's not that Siri isn't smart enough or Google Now isn't smart enough. It's that they don't have an API into everything that they need to have an API into, right? I mean, I'm surprised often at what these things can do. For example, they can actually control they can access the calendar, and they can set up appointments and stuff like that. They can make phone calls. So they do have APIs into other parts of the operating system. But if they can't access the accessibility controls, then somebody forgot to provide that.
Can I add one little remark about this. Okay, it's to me it's a big deal. As people age, they tend to become more socially isolated, and we all read about, oh, it's so important not to be lonely because that leads to depression and da da da. And in some usability studies where they're like, here, have this little robot, or here, have this device. What has been found is that if you have a reasonably intelligent, quote unquote intelligent, spoken interface, whether it's a robot or not, that it alleviates some degree of loneliness. And I'm not saying, to heck with your friends and family. I'm just going to talk to the voice menu on the phone. It's not that at all. But people can be so socially starved that it does give them some emotional benefit, and they can feel like they can, like you hear people talking to Alexa and Siri and blah, blah, blah. But it's some semblance of human contact that they might otherwise be missing. And for people some people don't want to do online banking because they're afraid they're going to get hacked, but they want to go into a bank and see the bank teller and exchange some words with somebody. And in elderly people that are homebound and there's some robots social robots, I would say, in Europe, and people find it's like a little friend. So I think there's another benefit to a spoken interface that we don't realize for the general population. Thanks.
It's interesting. You may have answered our last question, which someone else put onto this story. That was, which Google product do you think has the biggest opportunity for serving older adults?
Which Google what?
Product.
Which Google product? So if you look at Google's products, what has the most opportunity to be improved to help older adults?
I'm a Mac user.
Well,
The cars.
sorry? The cars, right? That's the cars, the driverless cars is a good place. Because so many people use the Google search engine, that also is a good place to improve. It's not that it's bad, it's just that the easier the search results can be reviewed and dealt with, the better it would be for everyone, including older adults.
And the speech.
Yes, and speech. So yeah, Google Now, the cars, and this general search engine.
Okay, great. Last call for questions. Okay, yes.
One of your quotes said something about very thin typefaces, and that seems to be kind of a popular design trend in some areas, or has been. And also light contrast.
Gray on gray.
Yeah, I see, like medium gray on white, and it's really hard to see in a lot of cases. What can we do about some of these design trends and try and, I don't know, nip them at the bud, if you will, if their usability characteristics are that bad?
I think you have to rant and rage. We're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore. I don't know.
What I
Because
do,
since iOS 7 came out, there was this whole minimalist thing. And again, I'm mostly familiar with the Mac stuff. And I've tutored so many older adults at different places, and they just can't see it. They can't see the lightweight font. They can't see gray on a white or another gray background. And the other thing is popular was white font on a black background, especially if it's small-ish. And when Jeff was talking about the Social Security site, you had to go through 7 screens to increase, because most of the people that we dealt with don't know, Command plus, Command minus to increase. They don't know about that. So the size, the contrast and the size of things is impenetrable to them. I don't know what the best avenue for complaining about it is, but it's an issue.
well, I don't think the best avenue is complaining about it. The best avenue is teaching people teaching future designers what design really is. That is, most of the students who come into my UX design class at USF believe that the class is going to be mostly about graphic design. and I quickly disabuse them of that idea. I tell them that it's no. First of all, many of them think that design is about personal expression, and I say it's not about you at all. It's about them, right? So we have to figure out who they are and what they want and what they need. But the other thing is that it's not even mostly about graphic design. It's about making sure that people can complete their tasks or achieve their goals. And, you know, that's mostly not visual.
Okay, thanks everyone for coming and participating, and especially Jeff and Kate. Thanks for coming to Google today.